The photographs arrived at the Joint Special Operations Command Intelligence Cell at Bagram Airfield on the morning of March 12, 2003, and the analyst who opened the envelope later told investigators he had to look at them twice before he understood what he was seeing, not because the images were technically unclear. The resolution was fine, the lighting was adequate, the camera had functioned exactly as designed. He had to look twice because the bodies in the photographs did not correspond to any identification system the United States military had in place. There were no fingers to print. There were no faces to photograph. In a classified after-action document that would spend the better part of a decade in a restricted archive at Fort Bragg, the senior intelligence officer who compiled the report used a phrase that has since become, among the small community of people who study such things, something close to a euphemism for a specific category of operational outcome. He wrote, with the compressed restraint of someone who had spent 20 years learning to say difficult things in clinical language, we were unable to establish the identities of the deceased. What had happened in the 6 hours before those photographs were taken in a series of interconnected compounds in the Kunar province near the Pakistani border is a story that was never formally reported, never acknowledged in a press briefing, and exists in the public record only through the oblique documentary residue that classified operations tend to leave behind: budget allocations, equipment requisitions, medical reports, and the occasional court-martial proceeding that surfaces a fact nobody intended to surface. It is a story about what happens when an organization designed to be the last resort is used as the first one, about the gap between what a unit is built to do and what the people who deploy it believe they are asking for, and about the specific kind of institutional silence that descends when an outcome is simultaneously undeniable and impossible to explain in language that the public would recognize as acceptable. To understand why those bodies were unidentifiable, you have to understand what Delta Force actually is, not the version that exists in the popular imagination. That imagined version is a kind of super infantry of exceptional soldiers who do what regular soldiers do, but faster and more violently. The actual organization is doctrine, its selection philosophy, and the very particular theory of violence were baked into its founding in the late 1970s by a man who had spent the previous decade watching the American military fail at precisely the kind of problem he was trying to solve. Charles Beckwith came back from Vietnam with a specific diagnosis. He had served as an exchange officer with the British Special Air Service in 1962. Watched them operate in the Malayan jungle with a precision and economy of force that he had no American analog for, and returned home convinced that the United States Army was institutionally incapable of producing what the Special Air Service produced, not because of a lack of physical courage or individual skill, but because of a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two militaries conceived of the soldier himself. The British model was built around selection rather than production. The Special Air Service did not take men and make them into something. It took thousands of men, subjected them to conditions designed not to build strength, but to reveal character, and kept the ones who remained after everything that could break them had been applied. What was left was not trained. It was selected. The distinction, to Beckwith, was everything. The American military ran on the opposite logic. Given sufficient training, doctrine, and organizational structure, any adequately fit and willing soldier could be formed into whatever the mission required. This was a sincere belief, rooted in the demonstrable successes of a mass mobilization military that had won a world war by producing competent soldiers at industrial scale. The problem Beckwith identified was that the kind of problem the Special Air Service solved was not a mass-scale problem. It was a problem of precision, of penetration into environments where mass was a liability rather than an asset, of violence applied with a specificity so extreme that the collateral radius approached zero. You could not solve that problem by training harder. You solved it by finding the specific subset of human beings for whom that kind of work was not a performance but an expression of something already present. Delta, operating on this principle through the 1980s and the 1990s, became an organization of perhaps 2 to 300 assault personnel. The precise numbers remain classified. It functioned at a level of tactical capability that had no meaningful benchmark in any conventional military force on Earth. The selection process washed out 70 to 90% of applicants, many of them already serving in elite units. By the late 1990s, Delta operators were routinely engaging targets at distances and under conditions that their own institutional predecessors would have called outside the parameters of human performance. They developed close quarters battle techniques that would not reach the broader special operations community for years. They were, in the most literal institutional sense, ahead of themselves, operating at a standard that the organizations tasked with overseeing them had no adequate framework to evaluate. The problem this created was not a problem of capability, it was a problem of comprehension. The chain of command above Delta, the generals, the civilian officials, the policy architects who decided when and where and against whom Delta would be employed, understood in abstract terms that they possessed an exceptional instrument. What they did not always understand was the specific nature of what that instrument did when it was applied. The events of March 2003 would demonstrate that with a clarity that made the classified report nearly incoherent in its careful language. The Kunar province operation had been authorized on the basis of solid intelligence, multiple source confirmation, signals intercepts, and human reporting from two independent networks suggested that a significant Al-Qaeda facilitation network was using a cluster of compounds near the Korangal Valley to move personnel and material across the Pakistani border. The authorization that came back through the chain of command described the objective in language that such authorizations typically used: disruption of the network, capture or kill of named individuals, and exploitation of any available intelligence. The word disruption was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. No one at the level where the authorization was drafted paused to define it with the specificity that might have produced a different conversation. What disruption meant to the squadron commander who received the authorization and began planning was considerably more precise than what it had meant to the officers who drafted it. He had 4 named targets, a compound layout. His intelligence cell had spent 11 days refining a 12-hour operational window before moonrise, and a ground force whose collective performance over the preceding 18 months he knew in quantitative detail. The mathematics of his planning process produced a predicted outcome that he briefed accurately and completely up his chain of command. The language was understood. Whether its implications were fully absorbed is a different question. The operation launched at 01:30 local time. The assault element arrived at the first compound 19 minutes ahead of schedule. First contact occurred at the outer wall. Second contact occurred 40 seconds later at the entry point to the main building. The third, fourth, and fifth contacts occurred in a sequence so compressed that the after-action timeline, reconstructed from individual operator accounts and 3 cameras running throughout, showed a total elapsed time from first contact to last shot of 11 minutes and 43 seconds. There were 22 people in the compound. 19 were killed. 2 were captured. 1 escaped through a drainage channel on the eastern perimeter that pre-mission imagery had not resolved clearly enough to classify. The 19 who died did so with a thoroughness that is, even accounting for the clinical distance of official language, difficult to describe without either sensationalizing what was a precise professional performance or sanitizing it to the point of dishonesty. A forensic pathologist examining the results later noted in his report that the groupings were exceptional. The operation against the second compound began 40 minutes after completion of the first and produced comparable results. It was during the subsequent documentation process that the intelligence analyst encountered the problem that would generate the phrase in the classified report. The combination of engagement range, engagement density, and the specific ballistic characteristics of the ammunition in use had produced results that the military standard biometric identification protocols were not designed to accommodate. The fingerprint database required fingers. The facial recognition system required faces. What the compounds contained was evidence of a network that had, in the preceding 11 minutes, ceased to exist as an operational entity. and 22 people whose identities the military would spend the next 3 months reconstructing through secondary means: DNA analysis, pocket litter, cellular telephone records, and the patient work of analysts who had never previously been asked to do quite this specific version of their jobs. The classified after-action review that followed was notable for what it did not recommend. It did not recommend changes to Delta's training protocols. It did not recommend modifications to the rules of engagement. It did not recommend reconsideration of the intelligence threshold required for authorization. What it recommended, in careful and somewhat circuitous language, was a clarification of the terminology used in authorizations, specifically that the word disruption, when applied to Delta Force operations against hardened networks, should be accompanied by a more explicit articulation of the anticipated outcome, so that the officials signing the authorizations could be understood to have comprehended what they were authorizing. This is, when you read it with the attention it deserves, a remarkable sentence. It is not saying that what happened was wrong. It is not saying that the operators exceeded their authority or acted outside the scope of what they were sent to do. It is saying that there was a gap, institutional, conceptual, linguistic, between the people who sent Delta and the people who were Delta, and that this gap had produced a result that was technically exactly what had been asked for, and simultaneously something that the people who asked for it had not fully pictured when they asked. The unit exists because certain problems require a capability that conventional force cannot provide. That capability is cultivated through a selection and training process so demanding that it produces something qualitatively different from what it takes in. The something different is then placed back into a command structure built for conventional force, overseen by officers whose conceptual framework was formed by conventional force and deployed under authorizations written by people whose understanding of what the unit can do is necessarily approximate. The unit executes, the results arrive, and somewhere in the chain of command, someone opens an envelope and has to look at the photographs twice. Delta Force does not have a press office. It does not issue statements. Its operations, when acknowledged at all, are acknowledged in the passive voice of official communiques, a form of silence that describes effects without agents, networks disrupted, targets neutralized, threats eliminated, language carefully chosen to convey accomplishment without conveying the nature of the accomplishment. The after-action review is available in redacted form to researchers with sufficient clearance, and its cautious prose rewards the attention of anyone willing to read it. As the institutional document it is, a record of an organization trying to understand in the aftermath of something it executed with total competence, whether the people who gave the order understood what the order meant. They had asked for disruption. They received it. The network never reconstituted. The facilitation corridor went dark for 11 months. 4 of the 6 named individuals on the original target list were confirmed killed in the 2 compounds. The remaining 2 were located and neutralized in subsequent operations over the following year. By every metric the authorization had contemplated, the mission was a success. The problem was not the metric. The problem was the gap between the metric and the morning, and the analyst opening the envelope, and the careful phrase in the classified report that tried to describe, without quite describing, what a unit built to the absolute limit of human capability actually looks like when it works exactly as intended.